Hi everyone, welcome to our fourth video lecture for our critical discourse analysis class. And for this particular session, we will be talking about intertextuality and assumptions. So this is the topic outline for this session. We have intertextuality, dialogicality, assumptions, and then we'll also talk about other concepts related to them, such as selectivity, implicitness, vagueness, hegemony, and recontextualization. So for the source of this particular video lecture, kindly look into the chapter 3 of Fairclough's work in 2003 on textual analysis. So in the very first session, we talked about intertextuality already a bit, right? And to review, intertextuality refers to the ways texts draw upon, incorporate, or respond to other texts. This can be explicit, like we're doing direct quotation, or we do reported speech, or implicit, like we paraphrase, or we do some form of stylistic borrowing, or we echo discourses. Probably the most common forms of intertextuality that are quite obvious that you may have already encountered would be, for example, when you read a research paper, you see in-text citations and they articulate that there are certain entries in that particular text that are actually borrowed from other scholars or other studies, right? And probably you also see a lot of intertextuality from one context to the next. For instance, when you read a news report, you would see that there are information there that come from different texts. Like, for example, let's say when you're doing a news report on, let's say, the increasing HIV infections in the Philippines, you might look at texts from epidemiological documents that is being released by the Department of Health, Epidemiologic Bureau, or you also would like to interview healthcare workers, and you would like to interview as well the heads of the DOH and other organizations that put together this data. You might also want to talk to civil society organizations that help in terms of HIV awareness, promotion, and care, right? And maybe you would also like to talk to actual patients living with HIV, and then that will be sort of the different text that you put together for you to be able to produce a news report. So that those are probably the more common things that you encounter in terms of the idea of intertextuality. So Fairclough posits that there are three forms of intertextuality that we see in certain texts that we are investigating, and these are direct speech, indirect speech, and unattributed borrowing. So, for example, direct speech is quoting another source verbatim. For example, he said, quote unquote, "I will be late." Right? And then indirect speech is summarizing or paraphrasing what was said without exact wording. He said he would be late. And then unattributed borrowing, using ideas, discourses, or wording from other texts without references. Like, for example, slogans taken from politics or advertising that become everyday phrases. Like, for example, sana all, right? Or keratin. So these particular things that become, become part of everyday colloquial parlance. These are called unattributed borrowing. We don't really have to say that this is something that has been said by particular people. It's just that it's not originally from you, but you use it anyway, but it's not originally from you, and you don't have to say whether or not who that came from, right? So that's unattributed borrowing. Next, let's talk about dialogicality. So every text is dialogical. It exists in relation to other voices and discourses. So for example, there are some texts that amplify differences. These are statements that sort of argue against another idea or a person, maybe to criticize lightly or strongly, right? And the purpose here is to stimulate debate, to express opinions regarding on controversial issues, or rally to support a particular viewpoint. And basically just to amplify that you do not agree with the other text or voice that you are trying to engage with in your particular text, whether that's in written form, oral form, or online. And then while there are those that suppress or erase then by doing consensus statements, no? For example, the general agreement or a united viewpoint of, let's say, of a group of experts. No, basically the idea here that you engage is you collaborate with the text, or you include the text that you're trying to, or you agree with the text that you're trying to include, or you lean heavily to the idea. So for example, ng polemics would be ang sabi ng iba, no, ganito daw dapat para maging successful, pero ang tingin ko diskarte ang kailangan. So that particular statement, no, sabi ng iba is already saying that you are engaging with a different text that sinasabi ng iba, whoever that iba is, no, and then the text which is ganito maging successful, no, but you in that particular text you position yourself as being against them, no? So that would be no? Or for example, consensus statements on the other hand is tulad nga ng sabi ng aking mga nakakatatanda, no, na dapat lagi tayong maging magalang, lagi tayong maging mapagrespeto, etc. So in that particular text, no, you are accessing or you are engaging with a different set of text na sinabi sa iyo ng mga nakakatanda, what your elders have told you. And your text, no, that you add on to it, no, in the particular text that you are articulating, agrees, no, does not separate or distance yourself with the group of people, no, with that or the voices that you are engaging with in that particular text. And then within text, there are also implicit meanings we call assumptions. And there are three types according to pragmatics. So pragmatics is basically implicatories that are found in text, no, based on the grammar, the word choice, the semantic choices. So that's sort of an area in linguistics. The first type is presuppositions, and this is background knowledge assumed to be shared. Like for example, even Maria passed the exam. Biruin mo yun, pati si Maria napasa yung exam, which basically, without even saying it, no, presupposes that Maria is usually weak or not so good at taking exams. Next is entailments. And entailments are logical consequences of a statement. Like for example, you say he stopped smoking or he stopped going to the bar. Entails that somewhere along the way he smoked before, right? Because he stopped, so he was doing something, no? So you didn't have to say it that he smoked before and now he stopped. When you say he stopped smoking, it gets, right, that person had smoked before. Next, we have implicature, suggested meanings beyond the literal based on the context. For example, late na, no? It's getting late. So implying it's time to leave. Or for example, paano ba yan? Nakarami na tayo. Implying it's time to leave, no? Or for example, you're saying, grabe ang hangin naman dito, no? It's getting windy in here, assuming particularly in Filipino culture that somebody is sort of grandstanding or very boastful in terms of the way they're speaking. And so that's another example of an implicature. And so, what does this entail when we do CDA on a particular text, whether that's formal, whether that's a speech, whether that's a document, a policy, or a social media post, or a marketing campaign? So, first thing is that we interrogate in the text how they identify difference. There's some sort of polemic approach to how the text, is the text sort of distancing themselves, from a particular discourse or a group of people, right? And we see a lot of political statements, particularly in the United States, for example, wherein there is a strong differentiation between the reds and the blues. And so that's an example of like how text can be used to be able to amplify that difference. So like I said, is there an openness to differences? No, for example, you're looking at a conversation, a printed conversation or a printed interview or probably a podcast, and you want to see if there's openness to differences, right? It's in terms of how they do their conversation turns, in terms of how they articulate and ask the question, right? Or is it, polemic? No, is it really instigating conflict? Is it really instigating that group A is different from our group? Or are there any attempts to resolve the difference, to come into an agreement, to come into a consensus? Or is there an idea that you need to bracket difference? Like for solidarity, for example, pare-pareho lang tayong Pilipino dito. Well, in fact, across, the Filipino nation, there are different social groups. And while of course that is a consensus statement, that there is also danger about like looking at these ideas in a monolith. Like for example, lahat tayo dito sa Pride March, all of us are LGBTQIA people, like, but of course trans experiences are very much different from a cis-sexual minority person's experience. And so there are some tough things that you have to navigate around those, and whether there is, if it's hurtful or not hurtful, if it is strategic or not strategic, what are the intentions behind that, what we can speculate behind those particular articulations, then that is what we as CDA analysts look at. And then consensus that suppresses the difference, right? So again, that's very much similar to what I gave. Text can combine these orientations in complex ways, particularly when you're doing a really strong statement, a policy, a letter, for example, explaining your side of a story, right? Or an interview or a podcast, for example, or a social media or a long thread, right, on social media. So how do these things come into play? We can also look into what the text universalizes or puts into particular. Particular voices or identities can be projected as universal. Like for example, a policy for employers benefit framed as good for everyone, right? Parang when you say, we're going to develop this particular piece of land, there might be some sacrifices for our IP communities, for our local communities living in this particular area, but this is for everyone. This is for the development of our city, our community, our town, etc. Right? And so, but in reality, when you universalize, right, the ideas or the intentions or the motivations of the particular, it can also be hurtful. So a CDA analysts, we are also very much keen on how the text is able to amplify those things. Next, we also investigate on the ideological structures, ideologies that are found within these texts and how they are arranged grammatically, semantically. Assumptions are often ideological. They naturalize particular interests as common sense, right? Kailangan ka magbanat ng buto dahil mahirap talaga ang buhay, right? Syempre, laging may competition lagi, assuming that capitalism capitalism and hard work are natural occurrences in life. Well, in fact, these are also very much artificialized and habitualized, institutionalized in society. Next is, we also discuss here the public spheres. Text can either promote open debate or dialogicality, or stimulate debate while silencing differences, like doing pseudo debates in mass media. Like you can only talk about a particular quote, or you can only just talk about certain things, or you can only just do this in a particular media platform because other media platforms may be more dialogical than the rest, but because you want your platforms to be more unchallenged or celebrated, then you go to a particular media outfit that would provide you that, right? So it's staging a debate. Well, in fact, it's really not a debate. So more examples, when we say intertextuality, for example, politicians' speeches borrowing from religious discourse like makadiyos, makatao, makakalikasan, echoing values from the Constitution and catechism or religion, right? So for example, in popular culture, like Marvel films constantly quoting earlier films in the franchise, like Avengers Assemble. So it's coming from an earlier franchise, right? To form a cinematic intertextuality, right? And then for assumption, campaign slogans, for example, para sa masa, assume that there's a shared idea of the masses, like everybody is part of the masa, when in fact masa is a very diverse group of people across gender lines, across ability lines, across religion, across geography, with different and a diverse needs, and political priorities, right? For example, memes like "sana all" is another example of an assumption, assuming that everyone desires the same things, like love or success or jowa, right? And then for dialogicality, right, would be, for example, you have fiesta posters that mix religious, commercial, and political voices. Or for example, when you do reality shows, right, if you watch Drag Race, Untucked, or other forms of reality shows, and that there are debates there, but actually it's the producers that limits dialogicality because they sort of cut scenes, they don't get the full context, right? So so those are some examples that are found in Filipino and popular culture in relation to intertextuality, assumption, and dialogicality. We'll discuss more about these things in the latter part of this session. Now, in universalizing the particular, a common concept that we usually deploy is Gramsci's hegemony. So Gramsci had coined this in 1971, and they argue that hegemony is not just controlled by force, but controlled through consent. So basically, hegemony is a form of control, right? When the dominated accepted worldview of the dominant is common sense. And this is very much an engagement with the work of conflict theorists about class, right? And how high-level class, dominates lower classes. And this time, as an extension of that, the ideas of this small elite group of people, becomes universalized and becomes common sense. Achieving hegemony is a political and ideological struggles. Elites must persuade others that their ideas represent everyone's interests and not just their own. And maybe, particularly in our today's world, you can make the world algorithm work for you. You make an architecture of this information for you so that everything feels natural, common sense, like the values that are being thrown based on the articulations that you're making are acceptable, and the ideas that are problematic are not put into picture, put into light, right? But of course, prior to social media, then you have generational transmission of diskarte, generational transmission of utang na loob, generational transmission of pagiging resilient, right? So these are all ideologies of hegemonies that, while of course they have positive connotations, but again, the idea here is that these are used so that the elites can still do the problematic things that they do in the guise of individualizing effort, etc. And then going back to our idea of universalizing the particular from the works of Laclau and Moff and Butler, right? Particular ideas, identities, or policies are presented as universal, as valid for everyone. And this is so very important, particularly when there is not much consensus or not much participation, or we don't call all for all walks of life in the decision-making table for the policies that we make. We assume that this is okay for everyone. But more and more in terms of the idea of good governance, when we create policies, particularly at the local level, there should be an invitation for different types of perspectives and groups. Like you have women's groups, you have youth groups, you have groups ng mga elders, you have groups ng mga LGBT, you have groups in terms of those representing disability, and religious groups, right? 'Cause so that you know that the policy would ensure that everybody's needs are heard, and that no one gets excluded from whatever good the policy is trying to make. And there are some policies that I feel have started to get into that. So the upcoming policy for the AI adoption, according to the ICT, is quite well argued now. While it's a universal policy, no, to ensure good governance and public administration for the use of AI is done correctly, transparently, fairly, etc. But in the context of fairness, there's already the articulation of different groups, right? Even the full SOGI spectrum. So I think, you would see that there are certain policies, and there you would see certain countries or nations or government institutions that you would see whether or not their policies are really just blanket policies that don't really embrace diversity, diverse voices and needs. And you would see that there are those policies that sort of embrace them. For example, and the most common, right, is neoliberal globalization. So you would see Fairclough really, fight against neoliberal globalization a lot in the article in the book, that they've written. So it is represented as an inevitable universal process, like it's a natural thing, like the world is supposed to get to neoliberal globalization as it ages, when in fact this is again manufactured, artificialized, normalized, institutionalized, habitualized, by the elites in the society, so that they can amass more money, and that their ideas and their institutions and their organizations would get most from the people who get less, right? But it is a political economic project that benefits only certain groups, right? And the billionaires, the millionaires, the top 1%, etc. These are what neoliberal globalization sort of tells us. Na parang, for example, in our case in nurses, you have to learn how to speak in English. You have to learn about the culture of the America or the US or the Saudi Arabia. You have to be a culturally competent nurse, because most likely you're going to be going to a different country and you're going to serve them. But this is the world now, you have to be quote unquote globally competitive. I hate that word, and this is something that is already in the DNA of CHED, or the DNA of DepEd. They have to be globally competitive, right? It means that we can export labor, we can export ideas and scientists and workers and laborers, which is, an effect of neoliberal globalization, because this is a 21st century thing. This is the fourth industrial revolution, and we can't stop it, right? And so we just have to let ourselves be pulled by the current or whatever, right? So that's a very good example of how particular interests are being universalized. So, right, so we already explained how globalization is coined as an unstoppable agent and agentless process. And this is more important, like globalization happens, like it just happens, like it's like birth, like it naturally happens without human agency or human agents. And one of the ways, right, that we sort of use language or text to be able to remove the agents, the harmful human agents, is through the form or through the process of nominalization. Ibig sabihin, you make that noun as if it's an agent. Like, globalization forces companies to innovate. Right? So that's like that. No, for example, innovation brings change, something like that. So what happens is that things that are supposed to be actions, like innovate, globalize, they become things, they become nouns, nominalization as it is, and then suddenly they become agents, right? Like there are no human beings, or there are no human agents or organizations or institutions backing them up, producing them, artificializing them, and mainstreaming them into our daily lives, right? And so what happens is that when we say that, for example, let's say the harvesting of the beans is done, let's say, with the most sustainable methods. Right? So that's the sentence. The harvesting of the beans are done in the most sustainable methods. And it looks like the beans harvest themselves, but they don't. There are agents that do that, right? The farmers, the workers in the field. But they, in that process, in order to make it sustainable, they are removed from the agent. Their agency is removed in the text. And so these are some techniques, right? To remove people, to remove blame, to remove accountability from the things that are happening, right? So there. It closes off the debate and limits alternative policy options because, again, universalized. There's no other way to go but here. This is where the world is now. If we don't follow through the fourth industrial revolution, 21st century learning, global competitiveness, we will be left behind. Look at our PISA scores and everything. Like, while it's true that our PISA scores are bad, now while it's true that, of course, many of the things are bad, we should improve them not because we want to globalize. We want to improve them because we want people to have better opportunities, whether or not they want to stay here or abroad. But globalization is not like the only option for our country and for our people to develop. Sorry, I'm getting heated. But yeah, that's the idea, no, of how globalization is actually a particular thing that is universalized through the everyday texts that we engage with. That sort of centers this and mainstreams this idea. What are other ways that, we where we universalize particulars? Like, for example, bakit ganon? No, aliens always attack the United States, and it's always the U.S. heroes that save us, right? Or, for example, in terms of algorithms in TikTok or in other social media that centers Western looks or trends as normal content, right? Now, when we assess dialogicality in text, whether or not we are afforded an option to debate with it, to argue with it, for conversation, right? We can sort of look at it as a spectrum. There are very dialogical terms and there are least dialogical terms. So, for example, when you say dialogical, most dialogical, explicitly quoting multiple voices, like employer groups argue, trade unions respond. If it's moderately dialogical, it uses modalized language like may, might, can, likely, those things, no? So globalization may require adjustments, leaving space for alternative, right? But for the least dialogical, these are categorical, unqualified assertions, right? Globalization imposes adjustments, like, so you have to adjust because this is the only way to go for globalization. Or assumptions that treat globalization as an unquestionable fact, right? So you have to be very keen on this, right? This is only just idea of globalization. You can talk about like hegemony, like for example in the conversations around, let's say, how people argue during the time that Carlos Yulo, Carlos Yulo and their family sort of had a public, their public opinions were, set forth regarding the situation in their family. And you would see how hegemony, like, there are those parang pamilya mo pa rin yan. So like, that's very least dialogical, right? They're still your family and you still have to do this, right? And so that doesn't open dialogue. Like, this value of family orientedness is a non-negotiable. You cannot, as you could probably can look at, about posts and how comments are done under that, right? And let's see how and you can probably like look, yeah, I can see who among are, more dialogical than the rest, right? So examples, like for example, in the Philippines, dialogical would be Senate hearings, right? Because there is a debate, there's an and then you have a group of people. Mr. Chair, may I say my point? Right? So or you have government ads and reports that declare a program is successful without critique or non-dialogical. Right? This is the reason why we should have freedom of information. Right? Like for example, TV talk shows hosting debate panels, right? Or versus press releases giving only one official narrative. So that's lesser dialogical. For example, Twitter Spaces with multiple speakers. Do you engage in Twitter Space or Instagram infographics that represent one-sided facts? So dialogicality also has something to do with genre, but also with the text itself. When I say genre, if you remember, right, the medium, no, and in the form of the text and how it's like forwarded. So how do we now operationalize dialogicality from the most dialogical to the least dialogical? So you can either do attribution, like you quote many voices. It can be modalized. So for example, you use the term may or can, or more categorical assumption like is or must, or straight up say an assumption. For example, attribution or quotation. Labor groups must say wages must rise. Employers argue it will harm business. So for example, in this text that you've articulated, you are showing multiple voices here, right? And as researchers, this is what we want to do, right? So when we say that a certain intervention is good, we also have to say critiques about it, right? Because we have to be dialogical as researchers. But sometimes that opens up for critique, that increases that lengthens the process, and that's the reason why some texts, attribution, articulations, and styles don't necessarily engage in the type, because dialogue is a lot of effort, obviously, right? Or it can be a modelized assertion. It leaves space for possibilities using may, might, could, can, likely, potentially, something like that. So we have a globalization may require adjustment. So as I mentioned like earlier. Or for example, health campaigns like this diet might improve your wellness. Or for example, when you're a TikTok creator, you say, baka experience ko lang to ha, baka ako lang naman to. This could just be my experience. So that's an example of a modelized experience. Like I am engaged with what I'm going to tell you, but I'm saying that, there could be other experiences other than mine. Something like that. And we have categorical assertion, like presents one interpretation as fact, closing off the debate. Like for example, as I mentioned earlier, globalization imposes adjustment. So for example, official press release saying the economy is growing. Like, okay, sure. Or for example, a movie tagline saying, this is the best superhero film of the decade. Something like that, right? And so like, okay, sige, kayo na. Or for example, you have a viral post like, for example, a certain artist does like the demure thing. Oh, this trend is dead. Like, dead na. Like, I'm not going to say otherwise. If you say otherwise, it's not acceptable to me. This trend is dead. Something like that. Okay? Next, we have an assumption. Like, it's the least dialogical. It treats the idea as obvious and shared. No need to state or defend it. Like, for example, in today's global economy, everyone must compete. Assumes that globalization as natural or universal. For example, your school policy memos assuming Catholic holidays as default. Or ads assuming that everyone wants to be fair-skinned or fit. Right? Kutis mayaman. Things like that. I don't know if you were alive during the time that came out, right? So there was this papaya soap that says cutis mayaman. Like everybody's skin pag mayaman ka is light and everything. Meme templates assuming shared language, like sana all, things like that. Now, another thing about intertextuality is that we all live in a sea of texts, right? We all live constantly exposed to a lot of discourses, a lot of voices, a lot of opinions. And intertextuality, sort of asks us, so we have a universe of texts, universe of other voices, opinions, groups. But eventually, in my report, in my articulation, in what I say, in what I do, in what I write, in what I post online, in the podcasts that I make, I don't necessarily have to invite everyone. I have to curate which voices I have to put. I have to, like in a sea of literature, particularly for literature that is super duper dami na, I can only choose a particular research gap to address. Right? I don't have to talk to the whole of psychology or sociology, but there's only a particular field. And even in a particular field or area or substantial area for study, I don't have to talk, like when I talk about migration, I don't necessarily have to talk to migration all the time. I talk to a specific migration study, like gender and migration in the Philippines. So that's where I kind of have to select my ideas, right? When I make a decision or a post, I am surrounded by a lot of texts in my mind. There are a lot of texts that are already inside me. There are a lot of sources that I can get. But at the end of the day, what comes out of my mouth, what comes out of my post, or the government's post, or the podcaster's podcast, or the influencer's TikTok, are selected. Right? And that's the reason why there is that argument, like, of all the things that you will have to share, why share this? Right? Or of all the things that you can exclude, why exclude this? What's the intention? What is the rhetoric that you're trying to put out? Right? The key analytic question is, which voices are included, which are excluded, and more importantly, as sociologists, our question is, what are the social structures that made this particular textual event, whether that's written, spoken, recorded, or in a video, in a live stream, why were they excluded? What are the social structures, forces, ideologies that make us exclude these particular voices, amplify certain voices? And probably you can remember a lot of political influencers and how they naturally, almost naturally, sort of, have a certain polemic tendency against a particular influencer outside their group or not include this information. Right? So this inclusion or exclusion is never neutral, as I mentioned. And this is why we're doing this critically. It's never neutral. It reflects power. Of course, genre conventions. Like, for example, if you're writing a news report, you don't put the whole text of the interview. Like, you just choose sound bites. And so that is an inclusion and exclusion thing. Right? And so we'll talk about genre structures, and chains. Like, what do we choose to include or exclude? Like, this could be genre conventions, but this could also be power, right? Like, for example, in the conversations around HIV, like, do we include them in the conversation in the first place, right? So, for example, in terms of like a good one of the examples that I can always think about is that when we have these conferences, like health conferences, we only see doctors, nurses, and different therapists and allied health practitioners, but you rarely see patients. And they're the ones we're supposed to be caring for, and they're supposed to be included in these conversations. They're the ones we are trying to research about. And they're supposed to be included in these events. Why not? Is it because of a genre convention of these conferences and things like that? So, again, and also, that genre convention is also influenced by power itself. Because do patients even have the money to enter these particular conventions? Those kinds of things, right? So that's intertextuality and selectivity. And then, as just to review, according to Leach and Short, there are different forms of reporting. Intertextuality. So again, like direct reporting, she said, I will attend the meeting. It can be indirect reporting, like she said she would attend the meeting. Or it could be free indirect reporting, like blends the narrator's voice with the reported voice. Like Mary gazed up. She would be there by now. She smiled. So for instance, so this one is very much common in literature. And then we have narrative report or of speech act. Like, it doesn't report the content, but reports the act. Like, for example, she made a complaint, she made a motion, but the content of the motion is not there. So that's a narrative report of a speech act. We also have to think that these different forms of reporting also has a corresponding dialogicality. Like, for example, direct reporting is the most dialogical. This one is more moderately dialogical. And then this one is least dialogical among them, no? These last two. And then when we do attribution, there's also a level of vagueness that we say. So for example, we do free indirect reporting or direct reporting, the reports may be specific, like according to the UN Secretary General or according to President Bongbong Marcos, or it can be vague. Sabi ng mga matatanda, some say, according to my teachers. So it's really vague. So it's harder to challenge. Next, we have also framing, like how the voice is contextualized and ordered in the text influences the interpretation. Like, for example, the choice of the reporting verbs. Like, for example, she said versus she demanded. So when you say demanded, okay, so there is this is not just an utterance that is value neutral. There is a demand. Or she lamented. So, nagreklamo, or she's sad about what she is reporting or whatever, right? Or she bellowed or she exclaimed. So there is some like extra feeling towards it, right? And sometimes meron pa extra. Like, for example, she said with a wistful smile something. So just to add more evaluative framing to it. It can also be a placement, like headline or a buried quote. No, can privilege one voice over another. And we have covert protagonist and antagonist structures position certain actors as villains or heroes. No? And we see this a lot in the context of let's say American reporting and the race of the reporter. We see how the placement of the headline is, let's say, for example, many years ago, we see Filipino nurse commits malpractice, kills patient, and I was thinking, and it was in UK, and I was thinking, if this was a UK based nurse, would they put UK nurse or local nurse in the headline? So there is it's a genre conversion to of course increase interest and to amplify worry, right? And so they would put that particular adjective there, Asian or Filipino, right? And that sort of tells us who the protagonist and antagonist is, no? Particularly, for example, if it's in the States, if it's a white criminal, usually they would say sino yung protagonist, sino yung antagonist. And we see this a lot in the Luigi Mangone case, right? So there are certain groups that place them as protagonists, there are certain groups that place them as antagonists in the way they are articulating their tweets, their reports, etc. Next, we have recontextualization. So again, when you move speech or writing or thought from one context to another, it transforms it. Like, for example, when you read a text and then I ask you to do a graded recitation to explain it. Of course, there will be some thoughts that will not be covered, will be lost, will be modified, right? And I tell you, okay, give me an example of what Foucault would say in this particular situation. Of course, you are going to draw on Foucault's thoughts, but you will have your own other textual influences in your life to be able to kind of answer me in that particular graded recitation. So moving from what you've read to what you're articulating would be something, right? And so, in for example, in news reporting, you do an interview, you write up, and then you make a headline, and then of course around that, you make also a sound bite. You make, let's say, a card, an Instagram carousel. And of course, these things will have to exclude certain information, include other signs and symbols like pictures and everything. And they have to, of course, this act, of course, includes and excludes. And, the first examples I gave is just genre conventions, right? But we've seen also, like, for example, the idea of spliced videos, for instance, like how let's say malicious influencers would like take a full interview and then splice it in an area where they could like, gotcha, you are not very intelligent or you are not very inclusive, and then when you read the whole text or the whole interview, a lot of context is removed, right? And so we contextualize when we move from when we report other text and move to a different form of text, then some of them are removed. Reports may substantiate authoritarian claims like journalism and legitimize policy, like for example, government reports over, let's say, yung tindera dyan sa daan, would say, no? Or yung tambay dyan sa daan, or let's say, for example, you are going to like a rally and there's a group of people there. So, and then you have an artista and then you have a group of people here. You would more likely, be drawn towards interviewing the artista because you feel like there's some more authority and some more heft to what they would say as opposed to like a normal person, even if that normal person is actually a community developer, a community organizer, who's done a lot of work for human rights, pero di mo alam, di mo kasi siya kilala, so you go to an artista instead, to interview. And this is an example of, again, which voices are included, excluded, and then put into paper, and then published, and then, the cycle goes on, and we solidify the discourse, we challenge the discourse, we feed onto the ideology, and our social structure goes on and on. Now let's go to assumptions. So assumptions have three types. First one is existential assumptions. These are assumptions about what exists, like triggered by words like this, those, assumes the identity is real and recognized. Like the global economy assumes that a global economy exists. So it's an example of assumptions that are existential. Or the nation's future depends on the youth, assumes that the youth is a single, unified, monolithic group. And in fact, it's also a very diverse group of people. The market is ready for this film, or the algorithm is shadow banning us, assuming that algorithm has agencies. Although there are arguments that it may have, but sure. So that's the first type of assumption. Second is propositional assumption. Assumption of what is, what can be, or will be the case. Triggered by factive verbs like know, realize, remember. Like we realize reforms are needed. Assumes that reforms are indeed necessary. So for example, we must modernize agriculture. Assumes that modernization is possible and necessary. Or for example, this franchise will save cinema. I don't know which franchise that is, but sure. And then we have, everyone's going to be using this app soon. For example, there is that assumption of what is going to be, what can be, right? Next, we have value assumptions. These are assumptions about what is good, desirable, or preferable. So these are triggered by evaluative verbs like and adjectives like threaten, risk, lament, help, good, bad, criticize. So education is the key to success. Assumes that education is good and success is the ultimate goal, right? But in fact, education is not always the key to success. And it's actually many things. True love conquers all. Assuming that love is the highest form of good. Because it conquers all nga, diba? Next, if you're not grinding, you're falling behind. Assumes that constant productivity is good. Or for example, social cohesion is threatened. Assumes that cohesion is good and worth preserving. Well, of course, there is a truth to that naman, no? Next, we have types of implicitness. So, for example, our presuppositions, which are assumptions, take something as given. Or we can also have logical implications, like meanings inferred from grammar and logic. For example, he's poor but honest. Implies that poor people are generally expected not to be honest. So, bakit naman ganon, diba? Why would you say that? Next are standard conversational implicatures, like meanings inferred from normal cooperative communication. She managed to pass, like implies it was difficult, right? And we have non-standard conversational implicatures, strategic indirectness often used rhetorically, like he is very punctual and very much well-dressed. Right? So he is very punctual and well-dressed. In the reference letter might imply that he lacks other qualifications. Bakit kasi yun yung ilalagay mo? Hindi mo sabihin na siya ay matalino. You wouldn't say that they are organized or hardworking. Instead, punctual, well-dressed. Parang, maganda ba siya? Talino siya? Maganda ba siya? Mabait? So you kind of know already that these are non-standard conversational implicatures. So, how does our assumptions, feed into hegemony, right? So, for example, our individual text assumptions, whether they are articulated as an existential proposition or propositional, or it can be value assumptions, right? This feeds now to the discourses that we engage with on an everyday day-to-day basis, a collection of shared ways of talking and thinking, whether across different genres. And then, therefore, they become part of the discourse. They feed into what is universalized, even if they're really just what particular people or groups really want, making particular worldview seem common sense. And now, what happens is that it feeds to system of ideas that justify social order, ideology, like heteronormativity, like may girlfriend ka na ba? May boyfriend ka na ba? Assuming that having a relationship is an important thing for your social life, right? And this now becomes part of the hegemony, feeds into the hegemony, wherein we are being dominated by our consent to these ideologies. Well, in fact, these are universalized, by a select group of people for their select benefits. And they are maintained as something that is socially natural, where in fact, as we mentioned, this is a socially constructed world. Not just socially constructed, but also politically constructed. And this now feeds on our everyday norms, everyday habits, and they reproduce the system, and they feed on to our assumptions that are found in the test. They feed on our discourses, right? And the cycle goes on, until it becomes habitualized, institutionalized. So, I've listed here all of the concepts that we have covered for this particular session. You can pause this particular slide and look whether or not there are particular ideas that you have not fully grasped yet. You can go back to that or read the book.